If we want to create stories from the perspective of the user, we need to think about the application the way the user thinks about it. Developers tend to see the application as a stack. There is hardware at the bottom. On top of that is the operating system. Then comes the database and application server. Then we have a database access layer. Above that is the service or business logic layer. Somewhere above that is the code that's responsible for the GUI. Everything is stacked on top of each other like a cake. So a developer is likely to think in terms of stories like, as a developer, I want a service layer, so the application logic is separated from the GUI. Or, as a developer, I want a GUI layer, so the user can interact with the system. Having a service layer is good. Having a GUI layer is good. But having stories to build each of these layers violates our principles. But it's easy to see why we might end up with stories like this when we recognize the way the developers think about an application. But what about the user? We want our stories to start off as fiction from the user's point of view. It represents the way the user's world will look once the story is completed. To write good stories about the user's world, we need to understand how they think about the software application. A user will think of an application in terms of the behavior they find valuable. So they might think of an accounting system as consisting of the part that lets them create the invoices, the part that lets them pay bills, and the part that lets them balance their accounts. They may know that creating an invoice means doing something in the GUI layer that gets passed on to the business rules and eventually ends up in the database, but that isn't how the application is organized to them. A developer sees an application as a collection of layers of cake that are stacked on top of each other. But users see the application as a collection of slices of cake that represent the different things they need to do. The fact that there is a database doing something toward the bottom of their slice of functionality is important, but only to the extent that it is necessary to support that slice of functionality. If we could build software the same way users think about and use software, we could deliver value much more quickly. It's a nice thought, but everyone knows you can't build a house one slice at a time. For that matter, you can't just create one slice of a multi-layer cake. You have to start at the bottom, right? Absolutely, if you are building a house or cake. But we are developing software. Code is not at all constrained by the same physical properties of buildings and desserts. We actually can build a slice of functionality in software. If it seems hard to do, it's because we're too set in our ways of thinking of writing code as construction or baking projects, where you have to complete one layer before putting anything above it. As we've mentioned before, the size of a story can vary from team to team, but a good starting place is to make stories represent what you think will take 1 or 2 days worth of work. This may sound like a contradiction. We just talked about creating stories that represent an entire slice of user functionality, and now we're saying the slices shouldn't take more than a few days. How can you create something that's useful for the users in a few days if you don't even have your database layer set up? This is where the skill of splitting stories comes to bear. Yes, it's hard at first, but it is possible. If you can take a story that's going to take more than a few days and split it into several stories that are shorter, you've done two things. First, you've created smaller units of work so we can keep everything closer to the same size. Second, you have now created the chance to prioritize the stories differently. This is a very valuable thing for the user because if some of the resulting stories are lower priority and can be deferred until later, the user can instead focus on stories that are higher value.